something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today I am joined by newly minted PhD Ben Thomason. His doctorate is in American Cultural Studies from Bowling Green State University. The title is Making Democracy Safe for Empire, A History and Political Economy of the National Endowment for Democracy, United States Agency for International Development, and 21st Century Media Imperialism. So as you can guess, Ben and I are going to be talking about the U.S. empire's so-called democracy promotion enterprises. It should surprise no one that, in true American style, quote-unquote democracy promotion is really just a branding strategy. And what the U.S. really seeks to promote is, first, U.S. hegemony, but secondly, they seek to ensure that countries pursue so-called democracy, which ends up being, as with U.S. democracy, a stage-managed spectacle designed to affect oligarchy. In other words, democracy promotion seeks to achieve the opposite of democracy. We are making this a public episode to help bring Ben's important work to the attention of more people. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. We are only able to do this work because of our paying subscribers. The tech monopoly platforms will never be our friends. So if you appreciate deep political analysis and forensic historiography, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Currently on the podcast, we are building on Max Arvo's excellent work, which expands on the Jack Ruby angle to Tom O'Neill's book Chaos. And we are working on our Gray Alliance series, which covers the extremely important institutionalized partnership between the U.S. regime and organized crime. We trace the evolution and consolidation of American organized crime and the essential roles it has played for the U.S. empire and the oligarchs who own it. We're looking at the Lansky Syndicate, Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters, Jack Ruby, the CIA's global drug connection, the JFK assassination, Watergate, and the Gray Alliance elements which link all these things. You can't find this material anywhere else, so if you want to understand how the Gray Alliance played a crucial role in making the U.S. into the corrupt, lawless, dying empire that we see today, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Ben Thomason, it's great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, you are a PhD now, officially, and you wrote about something related to the deep politics of U.S. imperialism. Your dissertation has the title, Making Democracy Safe for Empire, A History and Political Economy of the National Endowment for Democracy, United States Agency for International Development, and 21st Century Media Imperialism. And this seems especially timely now as Donald Trump is he's doing what he's doing. He's fighting the deep state, he says. He's going after USAID in particular. But let's take the bigger subject as a whole, the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and all that. What made you decide to look at this particular aspect of American statecraft?
Yeah, I have been fascinated for a long time by the idea that things can label themselves as one thing while doing another thing. So just because someone claims to be progressive or feminist or socialist or anti-imperialist or whatever doesn't necessarily mean it is that. So I've been very interested in how violence, imperialism, exploitation, colonialism can be dressed up in humanitarian clothing. And also, I was fascinated by the kind of historical amnesia, I think, that Americans often suffer through. This idea that we might have made some mistakes in the past, might have had some like racism in the past, did some colonialism and imperialism in the past, but that was the 1940s, or that was the 1960s, or that was the 1980s, and things are different now. And I was very interested in exploring how these things that we think are part of the past, that were mistakes of the past, were actually successful projects and strategies that have been built upon for over decades. That these were not mistakes. These were things that the U.S. ruling class state is interested in building upon and improving and continuing and applying in different places around the world.
Right, and this goes against the sort of mainstream of social science. You got your you earned your doctorate in American Studies, is that right?
Yes. At Bowling Green State University, they call it American Culture Studies. So there's a bit more focus on culture studies and pop culture, but it's essentially American studies and history.
That's interesting, and you could sort of unpack that culture aspect. Is it, on the one hand, that could be, cultural history, social history and stuff is honestly sometimes kind of frivolous in the U.S., like as a discipline, because it ends up, the U.S. has this globe-spanning empire hell-bent on world dominance, for the benefit of its propertied oligarchs. Like, that's really what the U.S. is about. And in some ways, I feel like the turn towards cultural things is a way to kind of pretend that we aren't what we are. It's sort of a top-down kind of thing in social science. But then, if you're willing to do it, this is definitely like the manipulation of the culture in different ways, and of cultural aspects to in covert operations. So it's even if they're gonna, you have I guess what I'm saying is you have the room to study that, even if it is an emphasis on culture. Like, this is really talking about the materialist aspects that determine culture, I think. How did you add a materialist approach to a department that is at least nominally dedicated to sort of cultural critiques and studies?
Yeah, I think you're right about the kind of frivolousness of a lot of this work that really bothered me during my time in the program. Not to speak bad of any specific examples, but there's a general trend in this kind of department and like culture studies that is kind of is basically like fan studies. People research pieces of culture that they are fans of. They like this TV show, or they like these movies, or they like this director, or they like this genre, and so they research it and they try to come, and then you kind of try to pile on rationality for why it's important to research. But the main reason that you're researching is it is because you like it and you think other people should like it and appreciate it. So the thing that kind of inspired me was realizing that the production of culture and the distribution of culture is very political and very materialist. So instead of looking at what is on the screen or what's on the text and just breaking down the text and saying, like, what kind of ideologies does this represent? What kind of what's problematic about it? What's progressive about this text? Instead of doing that, look at the forces that produced that text and made it popular in the first place. So I thought of, when I was getting into this research, something I found fascinating was Castle Bank and Trust and Paul Helliwell, and how you had, like, I think it was like Hustler or something that was like, and Creedence Clearwater Revival that was like putting all their money into this shady bank that the CIA was using to help fund covert operations in Latin America, particularly the Bay of Pigs invasion. So we would read about, like, say, like the porn industry in culture studies, but like what I found so fascinating is that, like, when you're talking about these things, it's not just music, or it's not just like pornography or whatever. It's connected to larger industries and connected to larger political and economic interests. And Paul Helliwell is a great example of that with helping to found Disney World. Setting up the Reedy Creek Improvement District and giving Disney kind of a legal fiefdom over their territory in Florida that allows them to exercise kind of semi-sovereignty over the area.
Yeah, Helliwell, he set up three things, you could say, that we could talk about, more than that, but let's say he set up Castle Bank, which is this drug money laundering, covert operations facilitating bank in the Bahamas. He also set up Disney World, as you say. There's been articles written on that, on his activities down there in Florida. He also established the Sea Supply Proprietary, which set up the post-war global U.S. drug connection to heroin connection, basically, like the mob and intelligence communities, heroin connection in Southeast Asia was set up by him. He also created one of the dummy companies, because he's always creating these corporations, right? He created one of the dummy companies that were running weapons to Israel in 1948 to establish the state of Israel. So who he was doing that for, was he doing that for the CIA? I kind of doubt it, but was he doing it for Lansky and Mossad? That he did work with Lansky. He was on the board of a Lansky. He was a lawyer for a Lansky connected bank. So yeah, these guys. That's a fascinating character, and the more you could look just at his life and think, most of what we learn in history and the news and civics class is just not correct. But you had to come to those kind of conclusions, right? Over time. I mean, the more you look into this material, it's just, there's all these rabbit holes you can go down. But the takeaway, if you just stop back, is just that this is tremendously corrupt. And so, how does the democracy promotion fit into this?
Right. So I think democracy promotion was something that I was very interested in since I was a little kid, because I grew up during the global war on terror, and seeing this combination of both American military intervention being combined with and framed as democracy promotion. That, like, what we're doing here in Iraq, in Afghanistan, wherever, is that we are, of course, fighting terrorism, but also promoting freedom and democracy. And just the idea of going to the other side of the world with guns to supposedly promote democracy and human rights while killing a bunch of people, I thought was very fascinating to me. And when I found out about the cultural Cold War history of, like, the U.S. national security state and CIA being deeply involved in the creation of culture as a soft power weapon, and how democracy promotion picked up on a lot of what the CIA was doing during the early days of the Cold War, was what really piqued my interest. So that historical continuity there of that we're continuing what we did during the Cold War in a kind of evolved fashion, under a slightly different pretext, a slightly different brand or flavor. That combined with this, like, democracy promotion also means sending our troops around the world and killing a lot of people and bombing a lot of people.
Right, and this is always packaged as helping the free world. I mean, that goes back to the American century branding at the during World War II, that like we should fight this war, and it should be a war for I mean, it was Wilson who said in World War I, make the world safe for democracy, but make the world safe for American free enterprise seemed to be the goal of World War II. And then afterwards, you see what that means. It wasn't a New Deal kind of Roosevelt thing for the world that was coming. It was more like the world was going to be run by like the Warren Hardings ultimately, the very just corrupt people who were super pro business and able to be bought off. People like Harry Truman. I mean, with a few exceptions, but. How do you see this change from CIA covert operations? Because this is something that's explicitly said by people who ran the NED. I mean, there's that one quote, I'm sure it's in your dissertation, where the guy says, yeah, what we're doing now is what the CIA used to do. But did you cover Italy at all? Because I've read, parts of the dissertation. I haven't read the entire thing. Do you cover Italy? Like, because that's one of the first CIA covert operations, and that really was all about an election. So this was like the CIA's first major operation really was Italy 1948 elections, right? It was 48 or 47, 48, I think. And I mean, they assassinated people. They did all these things to help promote get the Christian Democrats elected. Did you cover that aspect of it or no?
That one I cover very briefly as to frame the larger, I think, Gladio operations of kind of U.S.'s strategy to keep Europe in its pocket, and how that kind of established a trend. What I spent a little bit more time on actually is the, I think it was 1949 elections in Syria, where the U.S. Syria was kind of like the U.S.'s first attempt to promote democracy in the Middle East. And so
it was one of the very first covert operations too, the Syrian stuff.
Yeah, and they talk about, first of all, you have this guy Miles Copeland, who's a CIA guy deeply involved in these operations in Syria, who also has some really interesting music and cultural connections with him and his children. And
then he left the CIA and became like he went to Booz Hamilton, and he sort of spilled the beans on some CIA stuff. He was like one of the first guys sort of talking about the CIA. So he's a weird, fascinating character.
Yeah, and he talks about making sure that the Syrians elect the right people in their election. So I just thought that was very fascinating. This idea of like it's similar to the old colonial ideologies of like the white man's burden and the civilizing mission, that we are democratic, we have achieved democracy, and so therefore what other people need to do is get on the track that we were on and they need to become more like us. To become democratic means that they become more like us, and because we are democratic, that means anything we do in Italy or Syria, influencing an election, even is by just its own nature promoting democracy. Because we are democratic, therefore anything we do must promote democracy. Just in the same way that people used to believe that we are civilized, therefore whatever we do in Africa or the Middle East or Asia promotes civilization, because it's just in our blood.
Yeah. And I mean, the infuriating thing about it is that what they are calling democracy, which they are promoting in these countries, it's 180 degrees from the truth. Because democracy, I mean, I go over the definitions of democracy and to some extent in my own dissertation, and the most straightforward definition is just that a country is democratic to the extent that it is the public rather than elites, which controls the state. But what the U.S. promotes is not a country, is not a system where people who are interested in the well-being of the majority of the population control the state. They promote people who are in favor of helping a minority within the country and also being subservient to U.S. corporate and geopolitical interests. So it's really the NED should be the NEA. It should be the National Endowment for Anti-Democracy. Or the National Endowment for Imperial Oligarchy, or, I mean, you could pick for disguised fascism, whatever you wanted to call it. I mean, they're promoting top-down rule by an exploitative elite in almost every case.
Yeah, the guy who kind of wrote the sociological Bible on democracy promotion, William I. Robinson, back in the 1990s, had this really big book, and he called it "Promoting Polyarchy," which came from.
Was it Diamond, or whose term was that? The Polyarchy, was that Diamond, or was it
Robert Dahl?
Robert Dahl, yeah, that's right. I was thinking it was C. Wright Mill's old nemesis from back in the day, and I was blanking on his name, but yeah, Robert Dahl.
Yeah, so this was something that these foreign policy, national security state elites were very keen on. They recognize that democracy is a contested concept, to say the least. Different people in different classes have different views of what democracy is and what democracy should be. And
oligarchs have a different definition of democracy.
Yeah. So they were very careful in crafting their definition of democracy, and they insisted that what Dahl and Robinson called polyarchy is that what democracy should be is kind of the procedures of democracy, that you get to vote every 2 or 4 years.
Yeah. And of course they would say that, or I mean, Dahl would say that, and then Robinson would find that information useful.
Yeah. And it creating a form of electoral representative government that has the procedures and the kind of trappings of democracy, while maintaining by polyarchy, they essentially meant like you have a kind of elite pluralism where different sectors of business interests are able to come together and negotiate and find consensus and govern that way. It's a very managed form of democracy, elite managed form of democracy. It doesn't put much value in popular participation. It doesn't put much value in outcomes that are beneficial for the majority of the population,
especially economic outcomes. This is not part of the question, really, as best I can tell. Like, nothing can be called anti-democratic just on the basis of it being totally anti-democratic in terms of the economic consequences of it. Like, that doesn't enter into that idea of democracy as practiced by U.S. democracy promoters.
Yeah. They very much try to delegitimize or at least downplay economic or social democracy. That, like, saying basically that that's not really democracy's job, is to deal with these questions of like inequality and it's really just limited to like political and civic rights.
Right. And a lot of the things that they put there is like, oh, these are like foundational cornerstones of democracy, like property rights and an independent judiciary. Which, what does that ever really mean in practice when they talk about an independent judiciary? It means that they're independent, like they exist somehow disconnected from society as a whole. Like, what that basically means is independent from democratic influence is I think what they're concerned about. Like, they want it's just like it works in the U.S. The judiciary is typically an instrument of top-down rule to make sure that democracy doesn't get too democratic.
Yeah, it's kind of like when they talk about independent media abroad.
Yeah,
it's what they mean by independent is independent of whoever we don't like in that country.
Independent on the USAID.
Yeah, they're dependent on our funding, but that doesn't mean they're not independent somehow.
Yeah. Now, it's funny because if you look back at Dahl, his career is just, and the arc of it, at least as I see it in my limited time that I've spent thinking about him, but like I did have to write about pluralism, and he was one of the people that he's associated with pluralism in the 1950s in the U.S. And then C. Wright Mills argued with him and said, like, this idea, this theory of magic balance is just, it's not how the U.S. works. And so, but I feel like C. Wright Mills demolished the arguments of the pluralists, but the pluralists somehow carry the day in social science because they get more funding, right? I mean, that ends up moving the U.S. not in the direction of people like Mills, but in the direction of people like Dahl. And Mills I predicted how bad the political science was going to be. He said everything that in social science, he said everything that we try to submit to this statistical ritual, people say that it might be true, but it's not important. But I don't even really think it's true. I don't think we're getting at the truth. And then later, after he wrote The Power Elite, Mills wanted to write a thing that you would find interesting. He wanted to write a big study on the cultural apparatus. And he applied to the Ford Foundation for a grant, and they would not give it to him. But he was going to write about how culture is a function of the prevailing political economy, essentially. And like he was going to attach the production of culture and the influencing of culture by the sort of power elite configuration in the U.S., and he just couldn't do it. I always wonder if they killed Mills because he died very young, and I guess we'll never figure that out. But anyway, back to Dahl. So eventually in the 70s, it becomes clear that American democracy is so dysfunctional and top down and weird after the Vietnam and the 60s assassinations and Watergate and all after that. So although he may have revised this a little bit earlier, it may have been before the fallout of all that, but it was at least in the 70s. He wrote, he and Lindblom, I think, they wrote like a revised pluralism where it's like, okay, well, there's still pluralism, but it's like the business is like they have like it's like they get pluralism plus, like they have a little bit more influence than other people, right? And then later he revises it to polyarchy, which is even more getting towards oligarchy, But like polyarchy is what he says. But if he was really being honest about it, he would say oligarchy, but he can't really get there. But he gets a little bit closer to the truth, and then he dies in his 90s, and he could have gone much further, but he left it at polyarchy, and is just. But that seems to be the issue with social science, that if you are a good social scientist and you're describing important things, which is this imperial capitalist regime, then you will not win in the free market of ideas because you won't get the funding, you won't get all the prestigious awards and publications in the top journals. Like, this really is a key issue here. It's like the way that democracy promotion works is kind of overseas is not that different from the way the whole U.S. society and academia operates in terms of just like money, top-down money influences outcomes over and over again. And we think that we're seeing some sort of liberal process play out of like Enlightenment ideals doing battle with each other, but it's not really that. It's just really money determines the outcomes.
Yeah, I think there's a scholar, Gabriel Rockhill, who I think you've talked to in the past, who I think is really helpful in kind of framing these things, and that it's not so much that there's always a puppet master kind of directly controlling these things, but it's more like these people with money and power, they create puppet theaters, and the puppets kind of come of their own volition. And so, and the people who sing the right tunes and do the right things that the people who are funding these institutions want promoted, they get rewarded, they get promoted, they get funding, whereas other people who don't meet those interests are largely left out of the conversation. So they don't get published, they don't get prestige associated with their research. They don't get attention.
Right. And this is where it's like you try to look at different figures in academia, media, and so on, and think like, well, is this person some kind of intelligence plan or something? And most of the time, it actually doesn't, or as often as not, it doesn't matter, because the incentive structure is such that you will succeed in these different areas by acting basically as if you were an intelligence asset, or acting in ways that they would want you to act if they were to bother to make this or that person an intelligence asset. Like if you're going to be a social scientist in the United States and you want to get tenure, you would write scholarship that would be what probably what CIA people would think was okay for political scientists to be writing about, like not things that deal with their mission, which is perpetuating U.S. global dominance to the extent possible for as long as possible. I mean, this is really the downer of what we're grappling with here. But how did you find support for your dissertation in the department and outside the department? Because that's a key. That's the key to getting a radical dissertation, finished.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, I was very lucky to come across a professor of film and theater at the university at Bowling Green, Cynthia Barron, who was not particularly knowledgeable or didn't do a lot of research into this particular topic that I did for my dissertation, but was very supportive, was very critical of the kind of U.S. imperialist system, and was really just encouraged me and other students to follow our passions and to be brave. So it was her that was very encouraging, and then I got to meet Oliver Boyd Barrett, who was a professor at Bowling Green in the journalism department, and he retired back in like 2013. But as I was doing some of my early Syria research, I found this group. It was called like the Working Group on Syria, Media, and Propaganda, that included
Like Pierce Robinson, right?
Yeah, Pierce Robinson and Boyd Barrett was in there, and I was like, oh shit, this guy used to teach at BGSU. That's crazy. So I reached out to him, and we did a couple presentations together and exchanged ideas, and he was very helpful. We basically got him as an external dissertation committee member, and he was also very supportive and just had a wealth of information and insight into these topics. So I kind of had the support of someone who was already tenured and established in BG, and I found a friendly expert on the subject as well, who was still kind of tangentially as a professor emeritus connected to BG.
Yeah, and you have in your, I think it's in chapter 2, you bring in deep political scholarship into your analysis here. Was there any pushback at any point from people when you start talking about people like Lance DeHaven Smith and Peter Dale Scott and myself and other pretty radical authors about these issues? Because this isn't something a lot of dissertations get written on.
I was constantly debating that throughout my project of like how I should approach this topic and how I should write about it, because I knew that, or I figured I had to be very careful about writing these kinds of things and using that kind of theory. Cynthia was just again wasn't an expert in these things, but was very interested and thought there was value to it. And Oliver Boyd Barrett was totally into it. I mean,
yeah, of course,
he was already deep in this stuff. I mean, like some of the other committee members, I think got a little uncomfortable when he started talking about like globalists and globalism.
That used to not be what they say now. I mean, it used to. People like Michael Parenti used to talk about this. It used to just mean neoliberal, corporate one world types.
Yeah, right. So I was very sensitive to how these terms have been twisted and delegitimized through, Alex Jones, Donald Trump, kind of misusing these terms.
Does Boyd Barrett, does he use it in the Michael Parenti sense, or does he use it in the, like, I don't want to say Alex Jones sense, but the other kind of, like, does he think that this is a Western capitalist imperialism sort of thing, like trilateral, Rockefeller, BlackRock, dollarized world, or does he think that it's that the Chinese and the U.S. and Russians are really all just we're doing a sort of theatrical thing for the globalists?
He is, I think, very rooted in roots this very much in a critique of U.S. political economy is
And imperialism.
He's a bit more eclectic in his like theoretical foundations and what he focuses on, but it's very compatible with a more Marxist anti.
So that's what I was getting at. He wasn't saying globalist. He wasn't saying globalist like Alex Jones is what I was trying to figure out, that isn't my impression of the guy, but I know of him, and I recall coming across his work and thinking that he seemed to be on point when I was reading it. So I was that's when you said that, I was thinking, oh dear, because there's these days that the globalist thing means something else, but it's become a weird stand-in. It's like for some people, but he doesn't strike me as that sort of person. So they were okay, but they were generally, I mean, the things that you write about with it, as I saw it, you didn't really go into like 9/11 or JFK because you didn't really need to. The bigger issue, which I think is important to establish, is something like Watergate, obviously, or Iran-Contra. They really do represent state crimes against democracy. And Peter Dell Scott's definition of deep events also would describe these things. And those were guys who were published in by university press. University press is like, Peter got a book on 9/11 and on JFK separately published by University of California. That's pretty amazing. So he's there for people that want to use him if they can grapple with the material, which is actually so dense it's kind of mind-blowing, especially Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. That one is just astounding. But so at least you have that, right? I mean, was that your approach to avoid the super controversial things, because you kind of don't even need him to make your argument, right?
Yeah, my thought was to be very careful about the scope and make sure that I'm restricting myself to a very clear scope of just focusing on these democracy promotion institutions. So I try to get into what I think is most relevant from the Cold War before the Reagan administration. And I do get into the Iran-Contra affair, certainly, because that's one of the first things that the NED and this new democracy promotion apparatus gets involved in. But I just tried to stay as laser focused as I could and not go into tangents, which I think are very relevant and important for people to consider. But tried to maintain that kind of maybe a bit of that clinical distance that academics are often supposed to or expected to maintain.
Right. Because you write a chapter on Syria, which we might try to have you back on for just to discuss that chapter in depth, because Syria is so crucial. But it's when you really look at the totality of Syria and what we were doing there. I mean, you get into the Arab Spring, for example, right? I mean, can you summarize what your take is on the Arab Spring? Was the Arab Spring an organic movement for democracy in the Middle East, or was this an NED, USAID tech monopoly, extravaganza, or something in between, or what do you think?
Yeah, so I don't think I have the evidence to say to give a coherent narrative kind of conspiracy about the Arab Spring in general. I think that these democracy promotion institutions, one of their historical strengths was that they were good at highlighting real grievances and real problems in a society.
Right, of course.
And weaponizing those and opportunistically turning them for their advantage in situations where it is advantageous for them to do so. So they wouldn't
inevitably, right? I mean, inevitably they will look at what groups are there that have beef. What are their beefs? How can we amplify them and strengthen them? Though they would invariably do that, right? I mean, there's always going to be somebody who's unhappy about, or some group that's unhappy about the current government.
Yeah, and I think that's going back to the Napoleonic Wars, that is kind of the US, UK, Anglo way of waging war. Is you don't necessarily directly attack your enemy. You find a local group with some grievances, either real or kind of made up or self-serving grievances, and you ally with them and you encourage them to fight your enemy, and then you kind of you do what needs to be done to kind of mop things up or to finish the job. They get things started for you, and they do most of the fighting. They do most of the dying for you. So, I think in terms of they go by a case-by-case basis with these democracy promotion projects. So when it came to like Bahrain in the Middle East, and during the Arab Spring, there was a big movement in Bahrain for democracy against
it was just fascinating. And the NED was active there, but the NED was in no way wanting to overthrow that government and put in a democracy. But what were they doing that for theater, or why was that happening at that time?
Yeah, so
there's a military base there, just for context for people. There's a military, this is my understanding of it, and I'm not saying I have a perfect encyclopedia knowledge of all these small statelets over there, but like my understanding is Bahrain is where the Fifth Fleet is, maybe?
Yeah.
And they don't have oil. They're just cursed, and they don't have oil, so they're really dependent on the U.S. They're totally a vassal of the U.S., and they're not a place where the U.S. would be promoting democracy. But during the Arab Spring, they did have an uprising, and then you saw these pictures of like people with their heads blasted off and stuff. I saw when the regime cracked down on it, and then this became a thing about democracy in the Middle East. But it's like that's when I wondered, like, what was the NED like? Could the NED? And maybe this is a question to ask you. I'm sorry, this is kind of a long-winded way to say it. Would the NED in Bahrain, are they so cynical, and I tend to think they are, that they would be promoting Arab Spring type things in Tunisia, Egypt, and then Libya, and dovetailing it into Libya and Syria so they could, which were the real targets for these wars, right? But would they in Bahrain have democracy promotion and work on the ground just to identify who were the people that were pro-democracy, and then basically let the regime just wipe them out? I mean, would they be that cynical? Because I tend to think they would be.
Right, yeah, as a kind of like COINTEL operation. That is so that's part of the American imperial history. So for that example specifically, yes, the Fifth Fleet is there in Bahrain, and I think during 2012. You had Carl Gershman, who was the president of the NED for decades, talking about the Arab Spring in general. And when he talks about Bahrain, it's interesting. He basically says like, yeah, the people there are getting slaughtered, and yeah, the U.S. Fifth Fleet is there. So he basically kind of like threw up his hands and was like, well, we don't necessarily like that. What's publicly, I'm not supposed to like what's going on over there. But there's nothing we can do about it. But then in the same speech, he talks about Syria, and he's like, we have to do a no-fly zone. We have to protect these. We have to set up protection zones for these rebel-held areas. We need to do this and that. We need to really commit to this democratic movement there. So he like in some ways they are a bit open that like, yeah, in these places where U.S. interests don't really align with democracy, we're not going to promote democracy very, very hard. There's a book about Jordan called just came out a few years ago called Promoting Democracy, Reinforcing Authoritarianism, and they point out how Jordan is one of the largest recipients of U.S. democracy promotion, and yet there's no real threat to the monarchy there. There's no real prospect for a democratic transition in that country. In countries where the U.S. is allied with the current power structure, these democracy promotion programs, they serve a few functions. One is you can make it look like reforms are being done and that the regime is reforming itself and is a legitimate thing that doesn't need to be militantly opposed or overthrown. So you look at Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and say like, oh, look at these reforms they're doing. They're letting women drive, or they're modernizing, opening up to tourism, things like that. The regime is reforming itself. You can do that kind of public relations, You can also try to pressure the regime if they're doing something that you don't like. You've got these NGOs that if they start doing things you don't like, you can start making women's rights or democracy an issue if they start stepping out of line, and so you can create pressure that way. Or if you're really interested in a kind of controlled transition in the way that the US and NED did with, say, Pinochet in Chile, you can cultivate an opposition that is in alignment with your own national and economic interests, and you can prepare them to replace the current administration. And what you say about like potentially just rooting out dissidents through democracy promotion, I don't think that's something that should be. I don't have direct knowledge about like the Bahrain case, for example, but I don't think it's something that should be discounted, because if you look at the history of going back to US colonization of the Philippines, this was something that they did with the police force that they set up in the Philippines, where they did these kind of early proto COINTELPRO operations where they would try to identify radicals. They would set up fake nationalist organizations and kind of fake radical organizations to attract these radical nationalist types. And so they could put them on lists, so they could surveil them, so they could eliminate them if necessary. So, and certainly the uprising in Bahrain was crushed very brutally, and these democracy promotion institutions, while they probably weren't, they tend to focus on the elites of that country. So the people that they hire for their NGOs or their projects, they tend to come from wealthy elite families. So these are not the kind of people who are usually going to be radical dissidents in the first place. But there's certainly a history there of the US kind of creating honeypots, as you might say, for radicals to try to expose them. And
alternatively, they might have had the notion that, for this Arab Spring narrative, that they could put in some new group of people in Bahrain, and maybe it was the regime kind of cracking down on the U.S. trying to democratize Bahrain, not even because they had any interest in democratizing Bahrain, but because because of Bahrain, but because it was part of this Arab Spring narrative. I mean, Hillary Clinton was visiting with those Tahrir Square leaders like in the months before the Arab Spring. Like they were flown to Washington. This guy, Brian Berletich, he detailed this stuff back in the day, and he would write about it with links to the New York Times. I mean, it was. And then I think it's William Van Wagenen. He has a book coming out on this, if I recall correctly, and he points to policy papers orders signed by Obama saying that we need a transition to Mubarak. We need to get rid of him and make sure that this transition goes smoothly. A Muslim Brotherhood government may be the way to do this, And this is before the Arab Spring, so this is like. There seem to be a lot of things pointing to this being orchestrated this way, but then it gets dovetailed into really the continuation of the neocons' crazy war agenda over there that they articulate in the Project for a New American Century and the Clean Break Report, where they're, and other people have spoken about this. Whether the PNAC document had the invasions, I don't think it did explicitly, but people like Wes Clark have talked about the plans at the Pentagon to invade all these countries, and the Clean Break Report says things more to this effect. Also, you had the 2007 New Yorker article from Seymour Hersh where Prince Bandar, who's like the guy who was funding the 9/11 hijackers, basically, is saying that, oh yeah, we can redirect our head choppers to attack Hezbollah and Iran and Syria. This isn't a problem. So it's like there's so much evidence out there that the Arab Spring was a part of a U.S. agenda for the region, And then it dovetailed into a sort of pretext for regime change operations that we know they wanted to have in Libya and Syria. So this was, to me, it's pretty overwhelming that these entities that you're writing about, the NED, USAID, and democracy promotion and all this, that these are just, they're a part of a continuum. And I mean, they will, which on the other hand also has invasion. You know, the U.S. ends up invading Syria. Like, it starts with democracy promotion, you know, people getting on Twitter and Google and Facebook and planning to meet up to protest the regime. And it ends up with, I mean, ultimately with Al-Qaeda in charge of Syria and the U.S. occupying a third of Syria and stealing oil and shipping it to Israel via Turkey. I mean, it all is related here. And so this is, I think, valuable work. Were the people on your committee, did they kind of were they as aware of the scope of of U.S. imperialism, or were some of them surprised to learn some of these things, or did you pick all people? Because it sounds like your main person is a film person, right? Cynthia?
Yeah.
So did she know as much about all of this, or was she kind of like, man, you had me really go through some grim material, or how did they, what kind of feedback did you get from them? Like, not necessarily directly related to the text, but more like the bigger issues.
Yeah. So I think, like I said before, Oliver already knew pretty much all of this stuff. He was like, yeah. This is great work. I totally know what you're talking about. I've been researching this stuff for years. Cynthia was, I think, very fascinated by the Syria research. It was a lot of things that she had never heard of before, but she was already very cynical when it came to U.S. foreign policy and U.S. imperialism in general. So she might not have been super aware of these things, but wasn't necessarily super shocked by them either. One thing that she was very helpful on was encouraging me to look more into Haiti and the Haiti case study of overthrowing Aristide in 91 and again 2004.
So both times using drug-connected outfits.
Yeah. And that was very helpful for me because I wasn't initially going to make Haiti part of one of the case studies in my research, but when I did, I realized how brazen it was in Haiti. And
I know, both of them were.
Yeah, so I was like, this is a really great example because it's just like completely mask off. It's like they're not even trying to cover up what they're doing compared to, so it's like you get to see the real face of these institutions by looking at a place like Haiti.
Yeah, because in the first one, as I recall, it's chronicled by William Blum and I think Michael Sullivan also in his book, that they used the Haitian secret or intelligence service, which I think may have had the acronym SIN, like SIN, if I remember correctly, and that they were connected to all of these drug trafficking entities and so on, even though they were supposed to be cracking down on drugs. But of course, this is the U.S. empire and they're a vassal, so the drug law enforcement is really drug mafia management as often as not. And so that they overthrow Aristide that way after he was democratically elected. That's H.W. Bush. And then in 2004, Aristide is overthrown by W. Bush. And this time it's with some doofus who's basically they take him, I guess, to Dominican Republic. And then he's leading this armed gang, but he's really just like a mid-level drug trafficker. And they interview him. I saw him interviewed years later. And he, if I recall correctly, he was there looking sort of disheveled in like sweatpants and like a NFL shirt or something like that. And they were asking him, he did all but say that the CIA sent him on that mission to do that. But he just basically pretends that he's going to overthrow the Capitol and the U.S. kidnaps Aristide. Is that about how you remember the 2004? They send him to Africa, right? They eventually force him to get on a plane and they send him to the Central African Republic. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, the CIA's involvement in setting up that SIN intelligence agency, they committed back in like 88 or 89, there was an election before Aristide got elected. There was supposed to be a presidential election, and these SIN agents just like slaughtered like 300 people who while they were waiting in line to vote, and they canceled the election. And in 2004, it was the International Republican Institute, which is one of the main
one of the two, right?
Yeah. So underneath the NED, they have these core grantees, and there's four of them. There's the National Democratic Institute, which is affiliated with the Democratic Party and was headed by Madeleine Albright, basically until she died. The International Republican Institute, which was the international arm of the Republican Party, headed by John McCain, essentially until he died.
Yeah.
And then you had the Center for International Private Enterprise, which was affiliated with the Chamber of Commerce, and the Solidarity Center, which is affiliated with the AFL-CIO, so the labor international arm.
Which is a notorious CIA corrupted
AFL-CIO.
entity.
So in 2004 in Haiti, the IRI was going around the whole country talking to the opposition against Aristide and telling them, don't listen to the U.S. ambassador who's telling you to compromise with Aristide and to have peaceful, democratic, negotiations and transfers of power. Don't listen to him. The real American policy is we're going to get rid of Aristide. Don't worry about how we're going to do it. Just maintain a hardline stance. Don't compromise. Don't negotiate with Aristide because we're going to get rid of him eventually. And so while the IRI is working hard to make Haiti ungovernable, you have these other shady elements in the U.S. national security state organizing these like armed gangs essentially to invade the country and destabilize it. And then they say by the end of it, like they sabotage any last minute negotiations that Aristide was trying to make with the opposition. And they essentially say, like, look, we got a jet for you.
Yeah, they kidnapped him. Like, there was like a gunpoint, basically, more or less.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And so he says, like, if you want to avoid bloodshed, or you gotta leave. You gotta take this jet. And then as soon as he lands in Africa, Aristide says, I was kidnapped essentially by the U.S. government to overthrow the government.
I know, and the thing that I try to emphasize whenever I talk to people, who aren't so steeped in this, is that it's not that it's just a violation of like international law, which we know really has no basis of enforcement. These things are violations of the fundamental violations of the Constitution. I mean, the U.S. has the Supremacy Clause, which says ratified treaties are the supreme law of the land. The U.S. has ratified the UN Charter, which makes it the supreme law of the land, and the UN Charter outlaws aggression against other states or the threat of aggression. So violations of other states' sovereignty without UN Security Council approval are against the UN Charter and thus against the U.S. Constitution. So it isn't just a matter of, well, they're breaking this thing called international law, like whatever that is, in the rules-based order, which is really just the U.S. as the global, Führer or sovereign or whatever, right? But it's actually against the U.S. Constitution, and it's not very hard to explain at all. And it's never remarked on, like that we are just kidnapping another country, an elected leader, or any leader really, but kidnapping another country's leader at gunpoint and shipping him off to Africa is just brazen gangsterism, and it's totally illegal, and it wasn't even a story in the U.S. really.
Yes, yeah, that's a big focus of my dissertation. Is I wanted to say that not only are these things like designed to be limiting of what democracy is and like this kind of managed, truncated version of democracy, but even within that very narrow idea of democracy, they will abrogate democracy, abrogate the law, if it is in their interest to do so. I mean, Aristide, like in a different world, maybe he would have been like a perfect candidate for this kind of democracy promotion thing. You had a very brutal dictatorship in the Baby Doc and Papa Doc administrations.
If they were interested in democracy, you mean right?
Yeah.
If, just to clarify.
Yeah, well, I mean, like,
in a different universe where the U.S. cared about democracy promotion.
yeah, like if well, because those dictators like Baby Doc and Papa Doc, they're very useful for putting down and killing leftists or whoever needs to be put down in that country, but after years of them being in power, they start to cause problems for the empire. They're destabilizing. They are illegitimate, and so they encourage resistance in their own country, and that creates problems for the U.S. empire. So you don't necessarily want to have a dictator to be constantly in charge.
They get rid of some of the worst guys, like they got getting rid of Trujillo in Dominican Republic, right next door. Like, he was a guy that basically, from Eisenhower to the more progressive side, JFK, they wanted to get rid of him. I don't know that JFK authorized his assassination. There's no evidence that he did. I tend to think he didn't, but the CIA had made that happen.
Yeah, it's like, thank you for killing the people that we needed to have killed, but like, what have you done for us lately? If you're going to be causing us problems, then it's going to be better for us to replace you with some supposedly democratically elected neoliberal who's gonna advance our interests anyway and probably do it better.
Yeah, and you know what? In the case of Dominican Republic, they actually elected they had an election and elected a decent leader, Bosch, and Kennedy supported him. JFK did, and he was by the standards of that island, enormously progressive. And when he gets overthrown in a military coup, JFK tries to cut off aid to the island. He actually tries to reverse it, but this is in the last months of his life. And then, so he's not successful. And then LBJ actually sends the Marines to Dominican Republic to make sure that they don't put back to power the democratically elected guy, Bosch, who Kennedy had put in after Trujillo was assassinated. So here you've got kind of these paradoxes of democracy and so on in the U.S. You have a regime change in a country with a horrible regime, and then an actual transition to something democratic. But then in the U.S., you seem to have a regime change that gets rid of the most popular president by opinion polls in U.S. history, JFK, which seems to come out of the same clandestine apparatus, right? And then one consequence is that they reverse not just democracy in the U.S. by killing JFK, but they also reverse it in Dominican Republic, which has less historic consequences. It's more of a reversion to the norm for Dominican Republic, unfortunately. But it's just like, you see how it works. They could get rid of Trujillo. They get rid of JFK. They put in Bosch. They get rid of Bosch. They send in the Marines to make sure Bosch doesn't come back in. I mean, it's all there in that one little half of the island. And then Haiti next door is even more depressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, Bosch and Aristide were not coming into power like Fidel Castro. Like, they were not coming in as revolutionaries. They were not coming in like with guns. They were not coming in as like anti-imperialist firebrands.
Aristide was a little firebrandy in a way that I would say is positive.
So yeah, certainly in the first administration, but they were willing to, go through the constitutional processes,
sign deals with the IMF too. In Aristide's case,
yeah,
he tried to work with the masters of the universe.
Yeah, but they were just a little too genuine in their convictions of wanting to make a more democratic system for their people. They want someone who looks like Aristide, or maybe talks like Aristide and has a similar kind of aesthetic, but they want the actual content, the politics, to be more like Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately the economic things trump everything. It doesn't matter. Like, we have so many sort of neoliberal, superficially liberal bimbos really now in office. People like Macron and Trudeau. These guys are, even Obama kind of fits this mode, except he's even more polished. But this is like this new kind of superficially liberal statesman who seems to be younger, maybe 40s and 50s instead of 70s, but basically is ultimately a creature of, or a thrall of Wall Street or money.
Yeah, like a Juan Guaido in
Juan Guaido, yeah, they tried to make him work, and that didn't quite work that well. So I have two more questions I want to ask you. One of them is on the first one here is on one of them is on your dissertation, and the other one is kind of like, hey, can you apply your dissertation to current events? But let me start with the one on your dissertation. Tell me about the significance of the Ukraine operations for democracy promotion, and then how it led to this unhappy event. Because that's another case, like when I was talking about how the Arab Spring leads to the U.S. occupying Syria, and a head chopper, now the U.S. ally and head of state of Syria, like that absurd, brutal, deadly outcome. But then in Ukraine too, a sort of democracy spectacle is the beginning of that massive slaughter as well. So run us through the Ukraine case as best you can, in a few minutes here, because I know you probably know enough to talk about it for quite a while. But the significance of Ukraine, you spend a good bit of that in your dissertation, a good bit of time talking about it. How important is that to this? Because it seems to demonstrate a lot of the things that you've been talking about already, that we've been talking about already. Just another perfect case study.
Right. So Ukraine was a major project of the U.S. national security state, I think in general, after the Cold War, and especially, I think, the Democrats in the more liberal wing of the U.S. empire. It's kind of funny how these kind of different factions have slightly different projects that they like to focus on. For the Democrats and the liberals, it was more focused on like Eastern Europe, Slobodan Milosevic and Yugoslavia, and then Ukraine and Georgia as well. Whereas the Republicans were much more interested in screwing around in like Latin America, like Haiti, Venezuela, also the Middle East as well, especially Iran.
The Zionist aspect of the neocons is obsessed with all the governments in the Middle East.
Yeah. So the U.S. is instrumental in setting up a pro-U.S., pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-EU civil society and media environment infrastructure in Ukraine. And
which is, by the way, let's highlight how absurd the civil society quote unquote thing is when we're talking about this, because this is supposed to be by definition not the government.
Right. Yeah. So like, they say in their official guidelines and rules for the NED, they say that they are supposed to support. They're supposed to be nonpartisan. They're supposed to support any group that is willing to stick to democratic processes and constitutional regulations and things like that. So if like a group is willing to just participate openly in elections and go by the rules there, they're supposed to be open to supporting anyone. But of course that they don't do that. They support the groups that they view as being more aligned with U.S. interests, and they don't support other democratic groups that are less aligned. So the U.S. supports they go into these countries and they try to find organizations that they can work with, labor unions, women's rights organizations, minority rights organizations, media outlets, any kind of civil society group like that. They try to find people they can work with, and if they can't find people that they can easily work with that align directly with their interests, they often just invent a new group. So they say, like, well, that labor union's too radical.
They could do this because they have huge budgets, right? Like they can actually, if they have to, it's cheaper to go and co-opt existing groups, and plus it's more subtle. But when they need to, they can just create a whole group and fund it, pretty nicely. And in areas where you don't really find jobs, I mean, this is people in the U.S. are in sort of in the same position. They end up being idealistic and they want to do some NGO thing, and then but they're really just stooges for all the forces they think they're fighting against. But in Ukraine, they did have to not just corrupt existing organizations, but create a bunch of new ones, right? I mean, wasn't Victoria Nuland saying like $5 billion has been to Ukraine, and a good bit of that, how much of that, do you have any idea how much of that was funding for these kind of operations?
Yeah, so there's that. Yeah, this was during the Euromaidan. I think that was December of 2013, before the overthrow of Yanukovych. And she's at this. It's like the U.S. Ukraine Friendship Association or something like that. She's giving a speech to this crowd, and it's very creepy that like she's flanked by these posters that say like sponsored by ExxonMobil and
Chevron. Yeah. Big logos behind her. I mean, that was like amazing. You'd think that would not be good for their purposes, but they did it anyway.
Yeah. Right. It's like, you'd think they'd be a little more careful than that.
I mean, why not just have a CIA logo right behind her?
Yeah. So she says we invested $5 billion in Ukraine's Western democratic European future. It's very racist Eurocentric idea of like a European future, that like if you want to that like Ukraine, if they want to be prosperous and modern and democratic, they need their European future. That's what that means, is to be democratic and modern. But so when she says $5 billion, I think what she means there is not just the democracy promotion.
Right. That was only a fraction of it.
Yeah, that tends to be a small fraction. The bulk of that is probably things like development aid, like USAID stuff.
And just probably the general operating expenditures of the government in different, who knows, like some different thing, because they're so corrupt over there and they kind of depend on, this was the idea, you just make them dependent on the U.S. I mean, that's a ton of money for a country that doesn't have a huge annual budget,
Yeah, this is one of the good things for imperialism about keeping other countries poor and underdeveloped, is you can buy people and you can buy countries relatively cheap. Yeah, so in that case, a lot of that was just like we'll pay your bills for you so that you stay in our pocket. In 2004, there's a disputed election. A lot of these things start with a disputed election where you have some legitimate grievances and criticisms, some maybe less legitimate, and the NED and these groups, they mobilize into a like full scale thing of like, this is an emergency. We all need to, democracy is at stake.
No, get out there.
Yeah. So they try to heat things up. And this was the age, the mid 2000s. That was the prime time of the color revolution. I mean, these people were proudly talking about color revolutions and how this is a great way of, bringing down dictators and democratizing countries. They're fairly open about encouraging color revolutions, and so they are fairly successful in that. They manage to get a recount or a redo of that election. They get their guy in there. It's not the administration, though, is not very successful. This guy becomes very unpopular. I think it was Viktor Yushchenko was his name.
Right. He gets poisoned at some point.
I think he does. Yeah, there's
and that becomes a scandal, and then there are accusations as to who did it. But I think the conventional wisdom in the West is that Russia did it, but I don't take that to mean much of anything. I'm not. Do you know anything about the case and who seems to have poisoned him? Because that was the way it was reported in the U.S. was like pictures of this dude and his face is all jacked up because he's had radiation poisoning or something. It looked pretty terrible, but it was good copy for Western propaganda purposes.
Yeah, there are lots of weird examples of people getting of supposedly like anti-Russian dissidents or politicians or leaders getting poisoned and then not dying. So it's like, if Russia is poisoning these people, they're doing a very bad job of it. This
is not that. It seems like it's not that hard to kill people. This is to where especially the Skripal thing seems like that was not Russia that did that, and that is the most suspicious, obviously fabricated thing in my opinion, and yet we'll never get to the bottom of it. Probably the same thing with Yushchenko.
Yeah, I mean, one of the weirder stories that I came across, and it wasn't in my dissertation, but do you remember Pussy Riot?
Oh God, yeah, aren't they like on the NED record label or something?
Yeah, I think there's been they've gotten definitely support from that kind of milieu, if not the NED specifically. But the the manager, I think, for Pussy Riot, I forget his name now, but he was he was involved in a lot of like anti-Putin protests during the 2000s, and he like went to Ukraine to cover the Euromaidan protests, and he gets poisoned actually, and he gets sent to the same like German hospital that treated a lot of these other supposed like poison victims. It was very strange.
I mean, who benefits from the non-fatal poisoning of Eastern European dissidents? Like, that might be a way to that might be a clue for people, for the detectives that want to try to look into this, because who would benefit from that sort of thing? Like, it seems very good PR for the democracy promotion spectacle type agenda.
Yeah, and it's not like the dissidents haven't been killed under very mysterious circumstances in Russia outside of these poisonings. I mean, like several journalists, both under Yeltsin and under Putin, have died under very mysterious circumstances who were critics.
Russia has its own deep political oligarchic system as well. They have its own organized crime networks and who are connected to, this and that corrupted law enforcement, or the law enforcement as a whole. It's hard to have a grip on, but I'm sure that there are all sorts of things that go on over there. But some of these ones that you're talking about, where the person survives and it's like spectacular, those are the ones that to me seem very dubious.
Right. Yeah. It's not like the Russian state can't kill people. It's strange for so many people to survive and it be turned into media spectacles.
And in the Skripal case, he was going to return to Russia. He was trying to get back to Russia. And then they supposedly send these two buffoons, and then they won't let him talk to anyone. It just is, that one is so ridiculous. But getting back to Ukraine, with these Maidan protests, and you got Victoria Nuland out there saying, that we've given them $5 billion and so on. It does turn violent eventually. I mean, this to me is the sick thing, is that they encourage all these people, come out and protest. And then eventually, like, because they need to, it's like, well, we better shoot our protesters. I mean, isn't that basically what happens?
Yeah, so there's 3 mysterious sniper attacks that are kind of featured in the stories that I cover. There's the one in Venezuela in 2002, where there's mysterious sniper attacks that are blamed on the government, blamed on Chavez, and used as a pretext to overthrow him. And the interesting thing about that is that I believe in both the case of Ukraine and Venezuela, and I believe Syria as well, when the violence got started in the Syrian civil war.
Yeah,
these mysterious sniper attacks, they shoot the pro-government side first, whether it be like police officers or government supporters in the crowd. They shoot them first, and then they start shooting people on the anti-government side of things.
Yeah,
and like my suspicion with that is they're trying to create a major incident that can be used to mobilize people or to justify what needs to be done. And I think, like in some of those cases, what you want to do is you want to shoot the side you're opposed to, and then get them to start shooting back at the protesters, get them to start shooting back at the people who are supposedly on your side.
Yeah, and even if it doesn't work, you can say that, well, hey, look, these anti-government protesters were shot after some of the security forces were shot. They killed the protesters in reprisal, and look at that. Look how bad this regime is.
Yeah, or you just don't even mention the like pro-government.
Yeah, you don't even have to do that. Yeah,
got shot. You just say, we were the only victims.
Yeah. Did you ever hear, by the way, and I posted this on the podcast before, but there's this old interview I found with Chalmers Johnson in 2004, and he was responding to a question after the events in Venezuela where they tried to get to Chavez, right? And it's what you're speaking about when they're shooting into the crowd. And Chalmers Johnson says, oh, yeah, this is the oldest, they did this again. And he's saying this in 2004, but they would do this in other places like Syria and Ukraine. But he's saying this in 2004. He's saying this is the oldest trick in the book. The CIA does this time and again. You get these protesters out there, and then you have your snipers shoot a few of them, and then you can say, "Oh, the regime's thugs are at it again, and we've got to overthrow it." And you use it to overthrow the government. And so he was saying this so clearly, back then, and he's not even a super radical guy. He just actually was a political scientist who started looking somewhat objectively at the U.S. empire and what it actually does. But that's one of their oldest tricks, is to stage some kind of terrible, violent thing as a pretext for whatever operation. I mean, the Indonesia case, they have all these, they orchestrate. I believe that Greg Polgrain has shown conclusively that they orchestrated a sort of coup that went wrong in Indonesia, and that was used as a pretext for the slaughter of 500,000 to maybe 3 million Indonesians.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these tactics are used because they're fairly effective, and they'll use them until they are no longer viable.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to say about the Ukraine Euromaidan violence is, I didn't find anything particularly damning about these democracy promotion institutions directly being involved in the violence there.
Oh yeah, they probably wouldn't be. They just would work in conjunction with it.
Yeah.
They may have even been sad, like, "Oh, you killed Boris. He was my favorite pro-democracy activist."
Yeah. It's more.
Why'd you have to shoot him in the head?
Right.
Be like, Why? Because for freedom. That's why.
Yeah, it's more like, we'll get the people out into the streets. We'll provide the media that frames this incident in the way that we want it to be framed. We won't necessarily be directly involved or even have necessarily direct knowledge of planning for violence or whatever.
We don't want to know. We don't want to know.
Yeah. So that's why I think you need to look at how the soft power aspects of U.S. intervention is directly intertwined with the hard power aspects. That those two can't be separated. That they must be considered kind of in tandem with each other. So yeah, you had other people what was it? John McCain and Chris Murphy, I think his name, senator from Connecticut, going to the Euromaidan protesters and saying, we're here with you. We stand, you're standing up for freedom and democracy. Victoria Nuland also going out there, and these are all people involved in these kind of democracy promotion programs. And you and your audience probably know I cover this in my dissertation about the Victoria Nuland phone call with the ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, and where she infamously says, that would be great. Biden is down for it. We can get Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, to go along with this. And our boy Yatsenyuk is going to be the new prime minister once Yanukovych is gone. So that would be great if we can have the UN to glue this thing and have the UN help glue it, and fuck the EU. And when she says that, there are two different ways you can interpret that phrase of fuck the EU. There's one that is forget about the EU. Who cares what they need or what their interests are? We're doing our thing. Who cares about them? I think the other way you can look at it, and I kind of suspect this is maybe more what she meant by it, is we are going to fuck the EU. We are going to screw over the EU by doing this, because I think the Cold War and tensions with Russia are very useful for the US to keep the Europeans under their security blanket, to keep the Europeans from having an independent foreign policy, to keep the Europeans from
being neutral.
Yeah.
It's the same thing from the very beginning of the Cold War. That was their whole reason for establishing NATO and for writing NSC 68 and creating the military industrial complex, basically the rearmament, was that they needed to have a way to rejigger the economy and the balance of dollars so that Western Europe would not be tempted to trade with Russia and all of Russia's nice, cheap, abundant resources. That if they became intertwined, this is the nightmare for the U.S. And it was back in the 40s, and it still is today to the people who think this way.
Yeah. I mean, that's why they don't want, they were so adamant about not letting Russia into NATO. No, you're supposed to. Your role is to be the villain. Your role is.
Yeah, that's the whole purpose of NATO. Russia, don't you understand? Is to screw you in perpetuity.
Yeah, these uppity Europeans, they might want to, have trade and have security and peace on their continent, but that's not, we need to keep up the tension, so we keep the Europeans in our back pocket.
Yeah, and there is the whatever, all the liberal culture promotion and all that crap that they are doing. But additionally, in especially in terms of relations with the East, they'll just kill people, the leaders that are advocating East-West integration. Like Alfred Herrhausen gets killed in the 80s in Russia, and he was a Deutsche Bank, basically an oligarch, but he favored massive public infrastructure investment in East Germany, which was then had just been reunited, or they were working on that, and then also more German trade with Russia. So German industry wedded to Russian natural resources, and they blow up his armored car in a convoy with a very sophisticated military thing. And then they blame it on, they say, oh, it was some communists, but like come on now, communists would would kill the most progressive, basically progressive-minded German, elite figure in decades like that. And then the same thing in something similar in Sweden, which is a few years earlier, when Olof Palme is getting too close to the Soviets and having more of an internationalist approach. It's just like basically wanting to thaw the Cold War a bit. They start using submarines, and they pop up around Sweden, and they say that the Soviets are violating, Swedish waters, and eventually that makes the public more anti-Soviet. And then eventually they just assassinate Olof Palme, by all appearances. So, they'll promote the democracy, but if it comes down to it, they'll blow you up or shoot you in the head.
Mm-hmm.
Promote democracy. What we're talking about here, of course.
Yeah. I think this game of empire has always been extremely gangsterish, but for soft power reasons, you need to come up with pretexts and come up with ways of dressing it up to make yourself look good and legitimate, especially if you have domestic elections that you need to worry about.
Yeah. The result is that U.S. politics is basically one giant rolling cover story for what the U.S. really is. And I guess maybe the last thing I would ask you about here as we close, what do you make of Trump's efforts to shut down USAID? Do you take them seriously? Do you think they represent a real change in government? Do they represent maybe some strange attempt to try to privatize some of these things, or are they going to move them further back underground into the clandestine world so that there's not this transparency anymore? Because I noticed even before Trump took office, USAID, I believe, or the NED, I don't remember which one, maybe it was the NED, but they removed a lot of the databases about their funding and such, if memory serves. So what do you think is the changes that we've seen in the last, since Trump and in the immediate time before Trump, in terms of the way that these organizations operate? Do you think that Trump really represents a change in the U.S. as far as these things go, or is it going to just be darker and somehow worse, even with largely with continuity to the past?
I'm of some conflicting thoughts about this, and I think it's still a little too early to really get a good grasp of things. But it's very strange that, and although I guess it kind of makes sense in terms of appealing to his voters and his base, that Trump and Musk have framed USAID as this kind of
liberal thing.
Yeah, not even that. Saying that it's full of far left radical Marxists who want to destroy America. I mean, that is classic John Birch society talk. That's how people used to say that about the CIA back in the
Well, the
day.
CFR, the Birch Society thought that about the Council on Foreign Relations, which is basically Standard Oil in Wall Street.
Yeah, so like there's this tradition, and I think like historians like Richard Hofstadter have kind of written about this, like the paranoid style in American politics of a certain type of in the U.S. that views anything that whiffs of like liberalism or Marxism as being indicative of some grave threat or some grave infection going on. So like if you have liberals in institutions saying liberal things for soft power reasons, that somehow means that institution must have been taken over by crypto communists.
Yeah.
So it's very strange that they would talk that way. I can't imagine that they seriously believe when they say that they seriously believe that these institutions are filled with far left radical Marxists. That just seems absurd for them to believe it. Could they possibly be somewhat high on their own supply and like they've kind of gone full John Birch Society thinking in these things? That's possible, but I don't think we should underestimate these people. Historically, Republicans and conservatives have been very good about soft power. A lot of that CIA cultural Cold War stuff was set up by Republicans. The democracy promotion, the whole democracy promotion apparatus was the initiative of the Reagan administration. He and Reagan like came in poo-pooing Carter's human rights policy and saying, this is like crypto communism, or you're undermining America's national security. But he kind of took that and just rebranded it as democracy promotion, and kind of give it a more like Republican flavor, something that you can have more bipartisan consensus around. It was really like kind of nuanced and good, like elegant way of kind of combining those things and achieving a kind of elite consensus.
Yeah. Well, Reagan was strange in that he wasn't like a Birch Society person, but he managed to unite under the banner of American conservatism these disparate aspects of it. Like he did have the support of the knuckle-dragger right that would have been represented by the John Birch Society, but also H.W. Bush was like Council on Foreign Relations, more of the WASPy side of things, I think, the WASPy establishment. And you also had people like George Shultz, who was like one of those, free trade, neoliberal, commercial, utopian kind of conservatives, pro big business, but not pro-war in the same way, not a neocon. Mm-hmm. So he united the neocons and the sort of the neoliberals for a time. And that was like a moment there. And then it's sort of something with Iran-Contra is a schism there, I think, actually. I think Iran-Contra represents something that we don't quite totally understand. I think it may have been, the reason that it became the thing that it did could have been because of Israel, potentially. When you try to think of like, why did that become a scandal? Why did Congress start investigating these things that it usually just wants to cover up as fast as it can? And so this was what I'm saying is American democracy is kind of combustible itself, and this has to impact democracy promotion and the way that they think about it. And then maybe this is what we're seeing now, like there are different elements represented by Trump that were not the Reagan NED era, apparently, because Reagan creates it, and Trump seems to want to move away from this for whatever reason.
Yeah, a big function of the democracy promotion apparatus and kind of the CIA cultural Cold War stuff before that was to cultivate what Arthur Schlesinger called the vital center, that we need to have this kind of center-left, center-right consensus where we can all come together and fight against the real threat that we all agree on, which is communism. So if Trump is going to try to get rid of that, that could cause some real issues in terms of consensus making for the U.S. elite. You're supposed, like they say, the politics is supposed to end at the water's edge. when it comes to foreign policy. There's not supposed to be like politics between liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans. They're supposed to get along to advance a common interest. And if they're going to end that, that doesn't seem like a good long-term prospect for American foreign policy and empire. So it's hard to believe that that Trump and Musk really believe that kind of John Birch Society stuff. It's hard to believe that they don't see the value of this soft power apparatus abroad. I think they're less interested in that. Trump is more interested in like being a bully and throwing American military and economic weight around as much as possible. So he has less interest in soft power, and I understand that. But one interesting,
maybe it does two things. Maybe it kind of pleases the base because the base thinks, I don't like this. These liberal communists in the deep state promoting democracy with our tax dollars. You give them that, but then what's to stop them from moving these things to the clandestine realm where they originated from in the first place? And then there's no transparency. You can just say, we're not doing that. That's not us.
Yeah, I would suspect that they're going to try to continue these programs in different forms. I mean, that was kind of one of the reasons why they created the NED, was because the previous way of doing this through the CIA was becoming less viable, and because these covert operations were becoming exposed and ruining these projects. So let's kind of reconfigure these things in a more public sense, rebrand it so it doesn't have all the nasty connotations. This could be another example of like, let's just take these budgets that are in these institutions that have been kind of delegitimized, especially now that everyone's kind of talking about them, and move them to just another institution that's new name, new face, but same boss. So that's very possible. Another interesting thing, I think that I believe Mark Ames has said this, that first of all, the right has always been against foreign aid. They've always had a critique of foreign aid as kind of like, why should they think it's charity, and like we shouldn't be supporting these foreign countries. And also USAID and this democracy promotion stuff was involved in a lot of that kind of like fact checking and disinformation, like liberal disinformation policing stuff. Yeah. Which did really piss off the right, and that became very much affiliated with like Russiagate, which is still a very fresh wound for Trump and the right. So
which is a very dubious thing. I mean, they should have been able to get to the bottom of it, and they really didn't when he was in office, which to me raises a bunch of other interesting questions. Is why did they handle it this way? Why didn't they just ask Assange, hey, who did this? I mean, I think they could have done that. He should have pulled out all the stops to do that. Who leaked that material? And he never did. Like there was something explosive there. That was like political warfare by groups that apparently are too big to be exposed, because we've never gotten to the bottom of it, and that says something.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is very interesting. So there's a sense of like revenge, that this is revenge for Russiagate, and again, there's a general like anti-professional managerial class like politics in Trump and his circle, and USAID and these democracy promotion things, they are kind of professional managerial class, which does tend to have more liberal cultural and social politics. So
they use this stuff in foreign countries. I mean, my understanding was that it was a USAID or somebody was promoting like these drag show protests and things in Bangladesh. Like they had, transgendered people in places. And so the West, I guess these liberals think that's an attractive part of Western culture, that they are more like, liberated in these sort of individual ways, and not backward and conservative like these, the existent regimes in these countries. I mean, this has been like, they actually do try to weaponize American, wokeness or cultural liberalism, whatever we want to call it. Like, this seems to be an aspect of it, a branding aspect, which of course people like Trump and his supporters would really hate that most of all. They probably would, I don't know that they'd be that interested in the critique of imperial capitalism, but like you start, having U.S. tax dollars go to trans activists, and they'll lose their minds.
Right. Yeah. They see that, and it does catch their hair on fire. I mean, not necessarily realizing it's pink washing or rainbow washing imperialism. They don't actually care about these people. They don't actually care about these issues in Bangladesh or wherever. They're useful for American foreign policy, so they instrumentalize them. But despite the fact that these institutions were created in a bipartisan manner that included a lot of conservatives and right wingers, these institutions, I think, have evolved to where the people who generally get hired in these institutions tend to be more culturally, socially liberal, and that makes sense because there is more soft power kind of. There's more of a soft power arsenal that you can draw from when it comes to like social liberalism.
Right. Because like hard right wing conservatism is not really going to be the most popular sell. So, but this sort of liberation, hologram that they can put out is like that's what they want to do.
Yeah, it's like the right, they have like these vague notions of freedom and democracy, and that was pretty useful back when there was the Eastern Bloc and you had these like communist countries. But now that that's over, that those vague ideas of freedom and democracy, I think, are less relevant.
Yeah. Well, we've gone over how much over what I had planned to go, which was about an hour. And so, but your dissertation is really interesting, and these are fascinating topics that are right in my wheelhouse too. So we could probably go on forever about this. Hopefully, I'll have you back on to talk about the Syria case study because you spent a whole chapter on that, and I think that's a really fascinating and important one. Is there how can people follow your work? I know you're looking for a job. And that's a tricky undertaking because you're a radical, but I'll see. Hope maybe somebody in our networks or something will help you eventually, and that might happen. But is there any way people can follow your work elsewhere? Are you writing anywhere regularly, or so we just stay tuned until your job search is dealt with, and then you'll have some more academic output?
Yeah. So the job search has taken up a lot of my time lately. I'm still trying to do some research. I'll post like notes, research notes every once in a while on Twitter. You can just find me at Ben Thomason. I think it's Ben Thomason 95.
I'll put a link.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm about to have a co-authored chapter with Dr. Matthew Alford.
Matt's a great guy. He's a good academic, and he's funny dude too.
Yeah. It's a discussion about Hollywood's role in laying the groundwork for the global war on terror. And that's going to be in a book edited volume called Communications and Empire, USA Occupied Afghanistan. I think that'll come out in the spring. And I'm trying to work right now on a article about Gene Sharp and about how U.S. institutions interpreted and adopted Gene Sharp's thoughts and ideas and theories and strategies.
Right. Wasn't he in Beijing like right up until the violence broke out? I mean, that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, he was all over the place. And his kind of military partner, Robert Helvey, who's a colonel. Very important in like Venezuela as well, Burma or Myanmar, very important. He was actually born in North Baltimore, Ohio, which is just 13 miles south of Bowling Green. Like I've ridden my bike to North Baltimore, and it's funny that I've tried asking like academics all over Bowling Green State University, and none of them know who Gene Sharp is at all. Like they've never heard of the guy, which I think is interesting. Yeah,
I mean, he should be somebody that they would know, but I guess that's our job is to highlight some of these people, like Paul Helliwell. That's one other one. It's like you look into him and you're like, it just will send you down a rabbit hole and into the bowels of the U.S. regime, really. Well, I think that your dissertation is excellent. I hope that you are able to publish a version of it in the future. Do you have plans for that?
Yeah, I'm working on publishing it. I've sent in some book proposals. I'm waiting to hear back from Cambridge University Press right now. If that doesn't work out, I've got a few other options for sending book proposals, and I'll kind of be making my way down the list until I find someone willing to take it on.
Yeah, an academic press I think would be good if you're looking to get a job. And the other part about the academic situation is that I do feel that with the decline of U.S. hegemony, there is a chance that things may open up in ways that we just do not predict, because the imperial project is just not going to be tenable. And I don't know how long that will take. I don't know if the world will get blown up first, at which point, who cares what the answer is. But I do feel that, for people that are, people like you are going to be on the right side of history, if history continues to be written, because we're all still alive.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. It's unfortunate these institutions like academia are kind of rotting from the bottom up. So you've got all these people at the top kind of just like plugging their ears, pretending everything is fine, everything is normal. But I mean, that's increasingly becoming an untenable position. So hopefully that ends up making some positive changes.
Yeah, I would hope so, because things that can't go on forever won't, and don't. And then maybe the other sort of aphorism or that we could look at is the Winston Churchill quote that the Americans will always do the right thing when they've exhausted all of their options. I do get this sense when I'm watching Trump that he's basically out there exhausting all the options. Like that seems to be like the way to describe his presidency. So I think that there's hope out there. But anyway, I just want to say your dissertation is excellent. I'm impressed and admire you for doing this and having the wherewithal to do this and the courage to do this, knowing that there's no guaranteed path. I thought that perhaps I might be able to work with a cadre of academics led by Lance DeHaven Smith, and then he has Parkinson's and cancer, and he dies, and other people in that little group die also, and then I found myself having to make a podcast. But I wish you luck with your academic career, and I think that you are off to a great start with this dissertation, and we hope to have you back again soon. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I would love to come back on whenever would be convenient for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to it, and thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
As I said, we have made this episode available to everyone to spread the word about Ben's important and courageous scholarship. For now, you can follow Ben Thomason on Twitter. There's a link in the show notes. Please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for the best coverage and analysis of the deep politics of the U.S. empire. Subscribers can listen to our new Jack Ruby series and the Gray Alliance series on the Lansky Syndicate CIA Mossad threads running through the JFK assassination, Watergate, and beyond. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. It's also in the show notes. If you can't afford it, then you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and like and share and all that. But if you can't afford it, please do subscribe. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I'm very impressed that Ben Thomason was able to get this dissertation to the finish line with his radical anti-imperialist critique of democracy promotion. I am hopeful that the empire recedes, and if so, we may see a time when American academics can tell the truth about the lawless U.S. empire without academically self-immolating. Until then, we can at least explore all the ways in which the U.S. empire has bungled everything on the devil's chessboard.